The bellhop placed his suitcase on the luggage rack, a tired sigh escaping his lips. Room 13. Not exactly a lucky number. He tipped the young man, dismissed him with a nod, and closed the door. The air inside felt heavy, still, like it had been waiting. The room was standard, predictable. 2 queen-sized beds with floral bedspreads, a mahogany desk and a faded armchair. But something about the space felt off. The silence wasn't peaceful. It hummed with a low, unsettling frequency. He unpacked mechanically, his mind already elsewhere. He'd been drawn to this old hotel, the Grand Blackwood, by its charm and history. Now he felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. This room had a story. He could feel it, and he was about to become a part of it. Nightfall descended like a shroud over the Grand Blackwood. From his window he watched the sky bleed into hues of purple and black. The old town below seemed to hold its breath, shrouded in an unnerving quiet. Back in his room he tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. He read for a while, the words blurring together under the dim bedside lamp. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with whispers and rustles, the creak of unseen floorboards. He turned off the light, seeking solace in the darkness, but the shadows seemed to deepen, to twist and contort at the edges of his vision. He closed his eyes, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. A sharp rap on the wall jolted him awake. He sat bolt upright in bed, his breath catching in his throat. Silence. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of intrusion. Nothing. He told himself it was just the old building settling. But then it came again. 3 distinct knocks, this time from the wall beside the headboard. He switched on the bedside lamp, its light doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness. There was no one there. He got out of bed, his bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. He examined the wall, running his hand over the faded wallpaper. Solid. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster. Silence. He felt a chill, and it had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He called the front desk, his voice tight with forced calm. The night had been unsettling, filled with strange noises that seemed to come from nowhere. He had tried to ignore them at first, attributing them to the old building settling or perhaps the wind outside. But as the hours dragged on, the sounds grew more persistent, more insistent, until he could no longer dismiss them as mere figments of his imagination. The elderly night manager, a man with weary eyes and a tremor in his hand, listened patiently to his concerns. He had seen many guests come and go, each with their own set of worries and complaints, but there was something different about this one. The man's voice carried a note of genuine fear, a tremor that matched his own. It was as if the very walls of the hotel were whispering secrets to him, secrets that he was desperate to understand. He offered apologies, blamed the old pipes, assured him he was alone on that floor. The explanation was rehearsed, almost mechanical, as if he had given it 100 times before. But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in the man's eyes, the lingering fear that refused to be soothed by simple words. The night manager knew that there were things in this hotel that defied explanation, things that lurked in the shadows and whispered in the dark. But as he hung up the phone, a strange feeling washed over him. It was a sensation he couldn't quite place, a mix of unease and curiosity. He felt as if he had touched the edge of something vast and unknowable, something that lay just beyond the reach of his understanding. The night was far from over, and he knew that sleep would not come easily. He'd seen a flicker of something in the old man's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or maybe fear. It was a fleeting moment, but it had been enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. What did the night manager know that he wasn't telling? What secrets were hidden within the walls of this old hotel? The questions swirled in his mind, refusing to be silenced. Later that day he found himself drawn back to the front desk. The morning light had done little to dispel the shadows that clung to his thoughts. He needed answers, needed to understand what had happened during the long, sleepless night. The night manager was still there, his weary eyes watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He inquired about the history of the hotel, about room 13. The number had taken on a sinister significance in his mind, a focal point for all his fears and doubts. He needed to know if there was something about that room, something that could explain the strange events of the night before. The old man hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the shadowed hallway leading to the rooms. It was as if he was weighing his words, deciding how much to reveal. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was an incident, he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. A man. He took his own life in that room, years ago. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of tragedy and loss. It was a story that had been buried, forgotten by most, but the old man remembered. He had been there, had seen the aftermath, and the memory had never left him. The room had been sealed off for a time, but eventually it was reopened, the past swept under the rug. But some things cannot be so easily forgotten. The whispers, the shadows, they lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had once taken hold. And now it seemed that darkness had returned, reaching out to touch the present with its cold, ghostly fingers. The days that followed were a blur of unsettling occurrences. Each day seemed to blend into the next, a continuous loop of eerie events that left him questioning his sanity. The once familiar surroundings of his home now felt alien, as if he were living in a stranger's house. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension that made his skin crawl. He'd wake in the night to the feeling of a cold hand brushing his cheek, a sensation so real it would jolt him awake, heart pounding. The room would be silent save for the faint rustling of the curtains in the breeze. He would lie there, paralyzed by fear, straining to hear any sound that might explain the touch. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the lingering chill on his skin. The whisper of his name echoing in the stillness. It was always just on the edge of hearing, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He would sit up in bed, eyes wide, trying to pinpoint the source of the whisper, but it was elusive, fading away as soon as he focused on it, leaving him with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Objects moved, misplaced, only to reappear in their original positions as if nothing had changed. Books would be found on different shelves, keys would vanish from the table only to be discovered in his pocket. It was as if the house itself were playing tricks on him, testing his grip on reality. He began to doubt his own memory, wondering if he was losing his mind. One evening, as he sat reading in the armchair, a sudden chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped so quickly that he could see his breath misting in the air. He pulled his blanket tighter around himself, but the cold seemed to seep into his very bones. The pages of his book fluttered as if caught in a breeze, though the windows were tightly shut. The air grew thick, heavy, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if an invisible weight were pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped, struggling to draw in a breath, his vision swimming with dark spots. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer and closer. He looked up, his heart pounding, a frantic tattoo in his chest. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of what was causing the oppressive atmosphere, but there was nothing, only the dim light and the shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. He felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something was terribly wrong. The temperature plummeted, the air growing frigid. Frost began to form on the windows, delicate patterns of ice spreading across the glass. He could feel the cold seeping into the room, a biting chill that made his teeth chatter. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to ward off the cold, but it was relentless, gnawing at him with icy fingers. He watched in horror as his breath formed icy plumes in the air, each exhale a visible reminder of the unnatural cold that had taken over his home. The room was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the pages of his book. He felt a growing sense of panic, a fear that he was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The pages of his book rustling violently as if caught in a sudden wind. They flipped back and forth, the sound loud in the otherwise silent room. He reached out to still them, but his hand passed through the air as if the book were a mirage. The pages continued to move, a relentless, eerie motion that seemed to mock his attempts to control it. The room seemed to contract around him, the walls closing in. He felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, a fear that he would be crushed by the very walls that had once been his sanctuary. He tried to move, to escape the tightening space, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a malevolent presence that sought to trap him. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifted, and the temperature began to rise. He gasped, drawing in deep breaths of the now normal air, his heart still racing from the ordeal. The room was still, the shadows no longer dancing, the pages of his book lying flat and unmoving. The air cleared, the temperature returned to normal. The frost on the windows melted, leaving behind only a faint trace of moisture. He looked around, half expecting the room to change again, but it remained calm, ordinary. It was as if the house had returned to its previous state, the eerie events nothing more than a bad dream. He was left shaken, terrified, and utterly alone. The experience had left him with a deep sense of unease, a fear that the events would return. He sat in the armchair, staring at the now quiet room, his mind racing with questions. What had caused the strange occurrences? Was he truly alone, or was there something unseen lurking in the shadows? The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. He knew that he would never feel truly safe in his home again. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head. Stress, he reasoned, lack of sleep, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The unease had started subtly, a creeping sensation that something was off. It was the little things at first, misplaced items, strange noises in the night. He brushed them off, attributing them to his overactive imagination. Yet the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He switched rooms, but the disturbances followed. Each new room brought the same eerie occurrences, the whispers in the walls, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. He couldn't escape them. No matter how many times he changed his surroundings, the sense of dread clung to him like a second skin. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, watching his every move. The knocking on the wall, the whispers, they grew louder, more insistent. He would press his ear against the cold plaster, straining to make out the words, but they were always just out of reach, a maddening murmur that set his nerves on edge. He began to dread the nights, knowing that sleep would elude him once again. The feeling of being watched, it was relentless. He could feel eyes on him even when he was alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains seemed to signal an unseen presence. He would spin around, heart pounding, only to find empty air. But the sensation never left him. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him with their silent scrutiny. Sleep became a distant memory. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The bed that once offered comfort now felt like a prison. He tossed and turned, unable to find respite from the relentless anxiety that gnawed at his soul. He'd lie awake in the darkness, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind sending shivers down his spine. The once familiar sounds of the night had transformed into harbingers of terror. He would pull the covers up to his chin as if they could shield him from the unseen horrors lurking in the shadows. His reflection in the mirror became a stranger, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. The man staring back at him was a shadow of his former self, worn down by sleepless nights and unrelenting fear. He would splash cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the fatigue, but it was no use. The haunted look in his eyes remained, a constant reminder of the nightmare he was living. He was trapped in a nightmare, a waking horror that clung to him like a shroud. Every corner of the hotel seemed to hold a new terror, every shadow a potential threat. He would sit in the dark, heart racing, waiting for the next inexplicable event to unfold. The fear was suffocating, an ever-present weight on his chest. He knew he had to escape, to get out of the hotel, but every time he tried, something held him back. A sense of dread, a feeling that he was being watched. He would pack his suitcase, ready to flee, but then he would hesitate, unable to take that final step. The hotel had a hold on him, a grip that tightened with each passing day. But something held him captive, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand. He found himself drawn to the mysteries of the hotel, compelled to uncover its secrets. He would spend hours poring over old books and journals, searching for clues. The more he learned, the deeper he was pulled into the hotel's dark history. It was a puzzle he couldn't resist, even as it threatened to consume him. He was no longer just a guest in room 13. He was a participant in its story. The room had a life of its own, a history that was intertwined with his own. He could feel its presence, a dark force that watched and waited. He was trapped, caught in a web of fear and fascination, unable to break free. He was a participant in its story. The room had secrets, dark and terrible, and he was determined to uncover them. He would examine every item, every corner, searching for answers, but the more he discovered, the more he realized that some mysteries are best left unsolved. The room had a hold on him, a grip that tightened with each passing day, pulling him deeper into its dark embrace.